Dear colleagues and friends of the Institute of Caribbean Studies, my name is Melody Fonseca Santos, and on behalf of the Institute of Caribbean Studies and its director, Emilio Pantojas, who couldn't be here today due to previous academic commitments, I welcome you to the conference From Ruin to Rebellion, Hurricanes in el Grito de Lares and el Verano del 2019, presented by Adrián Bermúdez. Mr. Bermúdez is a second-year master's student in the Latin American, Caribbean, and Iberian Studies program at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. His research interests lie broadly in the environmental history of the Caribbean, with his current research project centering on the history of hurricanes in Puerto Rico. His research has been supported financially by the NAVE Short-Term Field Research Grant and institutionally by the Institute of Caribbean Studies. We are also glad to welcome Dr. Joseph Hartman as the moderator of this conference. Dr. Hartman is an assistant professor at the University of Missouri, Kansas City, who specializes in the visual culture and built environments of the greater Caribbean. He is author of Dictator's Dreams Escape, How Architecture and Vision Built Machado's Cuba and Invented Modern Havana, published by the University of Pittsburgh Press in 2019. He was also editor of the volume Imperial Islands, Art, Architecture, and Visual Experience in the U.S. Insular Empire after 1898, published by the University of Hawaii Press in 2021. His research has been supported, among others, by the Graham Foundation, the American Philosophical Society, and the National Endowment for the Humanities. Welcome to Mr. Bermúdez and Dr. Hartman, and welcome to everyone who is joining us through the Zoom webinar or the live streaming. Welcome.
Okay, well, I think this is my chance now to introduce Adrián and sort of lay out the groundwork for the conference. I apologize, early on I was telling Adrián I'm here at the El Monte here in San Juan, and they seem to always be doing construction whenever there's a live conference going on. So those are the loud noises outside, I assure you. I just wanted to say first and foremost that I'm very excited about this talk. It's going to be a bit of a surprise for me. I've talked to Adrián before about his work, and I'm excited to see what sort of new discoveries he will be revealing to us. One thing that I think is often overlooked about the history of hurricanes is the depth and relationship between hurricanes and politics and the development of cultural politics in the Caribbean. Not only how ruins and the destruction that hurricanes bring may provide a moment for reinforcing the status quo, but also how those moments of destruction also can upend the status quo and provide a kind of chaos mode moment where revolutions might occur, which I think Adrián is going to lead us through. I'm very excited to hear the talk today, and my job as the moderator will be to make sure, most importantly, that the questions and answers afterward are done in an orderly fashion and that everybody gets a chance to speak. So please, when the talk is over and you have a question, make sure you write those questions into the Q&A chat, and then we will try to go through each one at a time, simply because, in the Zoom format, it's very difficult if everybody's speaking at once. So we need to kind of go one by one, and with the rules established, I will now turn over the microphone to Adrián, who is making me jealous of the cold weather up in Wisconsin, looking very, very cozy. So Adrián, without any further ado, you may proceed.
Thank you. It's actually not that cold. It's like 67 degrees, so it's not. I'm bundled up a little bit because I turned the air on, but I'm gonna go ahead and share my screen. Gracias, ¿verdad?, por la introducción, Joseph, y gracias. Quiero agradecerle al Instituto de Estudios del Caribe por darme la oportunidad de presentar mi trabajo hoy con ustedes. Es mi primera vez. Aprecio el compromiso del instituto con la investigación, pero también con la tutoría de jóvenes académicos como yo. La presentación de hoy y mi proyecto de investigación en general surgió en parte de mi propio interés en observar historias ambientales de Puerto Rico y el Caribe. Mi objetivo aquí es colocar el huracán como una figura importante en la historia de Puerto Rico. Puerto Rico actualmente vive un momento de su historia en el que nuestros encuentros con estas tormentas son cada vez más catastróficos. Nuestro futuro frente a los huracanes requiere entonces que comprendamos nuestros encuentros pasados con estas grandes tormentas. A través de la historia de Puerto Rico, existen varios enfrentamientos entre la población puertorriqueña y los temporales del Caribe que sin duda alguna han dejado una huella en la memoria histórica del pueblo. Por ende, siento necesaria una investigación y un análisis historiográfico en torno a estos efectos atmosféricos. Quizás una reconceptualización de lo que han sido, de lo que son y de lo que serán los huracanes en Puerto Rico nos lleve a entender lo que significa estos fenómenos naturales. Y tal vez algunas lecciones o moralejas surjan que nos ayudarán en futuros encuentros con los huracanes. October 29th of 1867 would turn out to be no ordinary day for the people of Puerto Rico. It had been 12 years since the archipelago was last visited by a major storm, and for the residents of the island, it would have been difficult to imagine the destruction that would ensue in the late hours of that fateful Tuesday. The hurricane on that day of St. Narcissus of Gerona would become known as one of the most powerful storms in the archipelago's modern history. Yet, it was not just the strength of the winds that blew the roofs of the people's homes, or the heavy rains that caused the rivers to flood the streets that made the San Narciso hurricane a memorable storm. It was significant because it arrived at a particular moment in the history of Puerto Rico, a historical concurrence of conditions, events, and factors that altogether brought the Spanish colony to the brink of a potential transformation. In reality, 1867 was not a typical year for the people of Puerto Rico when it came to natural phenomena. The year's Atlantic hurricane season had already brought heavy rains to the archipelago. Prior to the arrival of the San Narciso hurricane in 1867, 29th of October, several storms caused considerable damage to Puerto Rico. Several storms, including a significantly powerful storm that struck parts of the island a little less than 3 weeks before the major hurricane. As a consequence, riverbeds across the island overflowed over and over, bringing about notable damages to an already crippling infrastructure. In the southwestern town of Yauco, the rising waters of the Yauco River caused a major bridge to collapse. In Guayama, in the southeast, more flooding waters damaged the bridge connecting the municipality to neighboring Caguas. At the same time, in the northeastern municipality of Loíza, flooding waters forcefully dragged another major bridge a long distance down a river. An October full of tempestuous rains and overflowing rivers would continue to cause significant damages to roads and bridges all across Puerto Rico in towns like Ponce in the south, Pepino in the northwest, and elsewhere across the archipelago. Yet, these calamities, these fallen bridges and damaged roads, paled in comparison to what the rains and the winds had yet to bring, what would become known as the hurricane of San Narciso in Puerto Rico developed near the island of Sombrero in Anguilla. Days later, and moving west across the Virgin Islands, the storm's eye crossed St. Thomas in the Danish West Indies during the early afternoon of the 29th of October. In St. Thomas, its effects were catastrophic, with accounts listing 600 people drowned. Hours later, the San Narciso hurricane entered through the northeast of Puerto Rico and traversed across the island, bringing intense rains and winds to much of the archipelago. By the time the sun disappeared across the horizon, the capital of San Juan was already experiencing the full might of the hurricane. The cobblestone streets of San Juan had become rivers. The illumination provided by lanterns was nullified as in the first moments the hurricane left the city in complete darkness. Those residents who were still in the streets ran hastily towards their homes, even as the force of the wind would push them to take a different direction. They had not lived through anything like this before. Historical accounts of the storm paint a bleak image for both the living and the non-living in Puerto Rico. The official records of the time list 211 deaths, 762 injured people, and almost 13 million escudos in monetary losses. The agricultural sector, the backbone of the plantation-based economy of 19th century Puerto Rico, was significantly impacted by the hurricane, with food and agricultural products facing most of the damages at almost 10 million escudos. Puerto Rico had already endured a difficult storm season that had weakened many of the natural structures across the archipelago and was now struck by its most powerful hurricane yet. Rivers would overflow and overrun people and their homes. Houses and buildings were destroyed or damaged. Roads became impassable corridors, and communication was lost across the island. First-hand accounts of the passing of the hurricane paint a greatly intense event. The acting United States Consul Representative in San Juan, Alexander Jourdain, experienced the storm during his time in the capital. In a letter addressed to the United States Secretary of State, William H. Seward, Jourdain laments how the storm caused considerable injury to the commercial and agricultural interests. Writing from his office in San Juan, Jourdain describes the experiences of those in Fajardo, Naguabo, and Humacao in eastern Puerto Rico as having suffered dreadfully from the overflowing of the rivers. It is said that the flooding was so intense in these municipalities that in the lowlands, large quantities of cattle and material was swept into the sea. Cayetano Colitoste, a known Puerto Rican historian and writer in his later years, provides another harrowing account of this late October storm. He witnessed the hurricane as a teenager in San Juan, where at the time he was a student in the Jesuit Seminary College. Colitoste recalls the frightening roar of the wind and the striding sounds of doors and windows bellowing against the gale. The San Juan harbor was completely destroyed, he recounts. All types of ships succumbed to the turbulent winds and rains of the San Narciso hurricane. Frigates, schooners, barges, and brigs, every class of ship in the harbor ended up either at the bottom of the bay or stranded at different points. While the exact losses in San Juan proper, either in escudos or in deaths, remains unclear, other towns' records survive to quantify the catastrophe that befell upon the island. The northwestern town of Isabela, for example, had the good fortune of suffering 0 deaths caused by the hurricane, with most of its financial losses pertaining to the agricultural production of the municipality. Small landlords whose products of choice were minor crops were the hardest hit in Isabela. The cultivation of plantains in the municipality suffered immensely, with a loss of 524 acres of plantain crops worth a total of 26,200 escudos destroyed. In total, 6,419 loads of plantains worth 12,838 escudos were lost to the storm. In contrast, the cultivation of sugar in Isabela suffered considerably less, with 100 acres of sugarcane worth 4,880 escudos destroyed and 570 quintals of sugar worth 3,900 escudos lost. Coffee, on the other hand, a dominant crop in the northwestern highland of Puerto Rico at the time, suffered significantly more than the cultivation of sugar. The cultivation of coffee in the municipality lost 593 quintals of coffee for a total of 11,500 escudos in losses. In total, agricultural damages in Isabela amounted to 99,362 escudos, or 90% of the total losses inflicted by the hurricane of San Narciso on Isabela. While this presentation serves not to name and enumerate all of the monetary and human losses attributed to the storm, municipality, by municipality, it remains essential to point out the hurricane's impact across different points in the island. Tucked in between the northwestern highlands and Pepino, records indicate that one person died and another suffered some sort of injury. Financially, Pepino suffered a total loss of 100,354 escudos, with a significant portion of these damages arising among the municipality's coffee sector. In Ponce, the second largest city of Puerto Rico, 3 people died, while 32 people were either injured or bruised. In terms of monetary losses, Ponce's total damages amounted to a whopping 615,980 escudos, most of it attributed to losses in sugar and coffee. Meanwhile, in Fajardo, the eastern municipality and one of the first to encounter the San Narciso hurricane, suffered the most human and housing losses in all of Puerto Rico. In total, 13 people perished and 113 remained injured or bruised after the storm. Overall damages were worth 532,080 escudos, with 327,702 of these coming in property damages. Across the archipelago, the plantation economy of Puerto Rico suffered considerable losses to its most important crops. Coffee, for one, was about to be harvested with great abundance expected for the year's crop yield. Yet, the hurricane of San Narciso inflicted immense damage to the crop. Estimates show that half of the year's entire crop was lost as a consequence of the storm. It is no surprise then that the production of coffee suffered a recession in Puerto Rico during that year of San Narciso hurricane, as well as the year that followed in 1868. In addition to coffee, the minor crops of rice, corn, and plantains suffered the near complete destruction of their respective crops. It is also necessary to highlight that the people of Puerto Rico's burdensome experiences with the 1867 Atlantic hurricane season were further heightened by the occurrence of a series of earthquakes, with the first one starting a mere 3 weeks after the San Narciso hurricane. At 2:50 o'clock in the afternoon on November 18th of 1867, an earthquake shook Puerto Rico. A total of 3 tremors would be felt on that day, and in the days that followed, quakes would be felt almost every day across Puerto Rico, sometimes even multiple times a day. The constant shaking of the earth undoubtedly shook the infrastructural conditions of the island even further towards ruin. In the northern town of Bayamon, an entire church collapsed as it felt the first earthquake on the 18th, much to the dismay of a terrified neighborhood who had lost their blazon of religious sentiments. The earthquake of the 18th quartered a whole church and damaged several other buildings in Yabucoa and eastern Puerto Rico, leading many rural residents to come into the town to give thanks to the Almighty and ask for mercy. By the 14th of February of the following year, general alarm over the almost daily tremors have subsided to the point where the residents of San Juan, who had fled to the countryside in haste, had begun to return to their homes in the city. The earthquakes and tremors finally subsided about a month later in March of 1868. Storm after storm and quake after quake, Puerto Rico was in a state of disaster. Relief and reconstruction efforts would soon put to the test a declining Spanish empire and an increasingly distrustful Puerto Rican populace. In an attempt to curtail the effects of the natural phenomena on the island's poor residents, Spanish officials moved to propose a tax on the sale of meat that would last for 3 months. In addition to this effort, the Spanish government in Madrid, by way of the superior civil government of Cuba, decreed an exemption on import duties in Puerto Rico on certain goods. These items included olive oil, garlic, lard, wheat, sardines, live cattle, guano, wooden houses, sugar mills, and over a dozen other items. This exception would allow foreign vessels, regardless of nationality and imperial denomination, to dock in any port in Puerto Rico and enjoy duty-free import privileges on any of these exempted goods. Soon after this decree, exempting import taxes on dozens of items and the opening of Puerto Rican ports to international trade, a cholera outbreak was brewing across the Caribbean islands. A cholera epidemic in Puerto Rico had left some 30,000 people dead only a dozen years prior in 1855. Fresh in the minds and imaginations of Puerto Rican historical memory, the local government sought to prevent the disease from re-emerging in the archipelago. As such, the local government shut down all of the island's ports to ships arriving from Havana, Cuba. By January 28th of the following year, cholera had arrived in St. Thomas, and once again, the local government in Puerto Rico barred ships coming into their ports from the neighboring island. A rumor making its way to San Juan declared that cholera had arrived in Santo Domingo just 2 weeks after its appearance had been recorded in St. Thomas. Though recent news from Cuba and St. Thomas noted that the outbreak of cholera had been contained and the disease no longer posed a threat. For all that, the local government of Puerto Rico, in fear of another cholera outbreak, blocked the arrival of potentially vital imported goods from Cuba and St. Thomas for months, while the archipelago was still feeling the effects of multiple natural phenomena. Across Puerto Rico, the calls for the Spanish government and its colonial representatives in the archipelago to provide aid in reconstruction began to intensify. Yet, the political and economic situation of the island had become untenable by the 1860s, with the decaying Spanish Empire increasingly unable to support its colonial ventures. The Spanish had exhausted many of their efforts, attempting to reoccupy their old Santo Domingo colony a couple of years prior, leaving the Spanish royal treasuries on the brink of financial ruin. In Puerto Rico, the Spanish colonial government's investment on the island's infrastructure was minimal, with only 3% of the government's total expenditure within the last decade going towards public works. The storms and the quakes of 1867 had occurred amidst a complicated and tense situation in Puerto Rico. A Spanish official, Vicente Fontán y Mera, recognized the unpleasant reality of the situation. He recounts in his wonderfully detailed and rich exposition, La Memorable Noche de San Narciso y los Temblores de Tierra, how the situation that the island of Puerto Rico is going through cannot be prolonged. That is a truth so intuitive and unfortunately so proven that all but a number of delusions recognize it without discussion and without examination. The lack of investment in the island's infrastructure by the Spanish colonial government was a major factor in the tensions present in Puerto Rico at the time. After the storm and the quakes, government orders intended for non-urgent funds within municipal budgets to be used as the first line of aid relief. Yet in towns across Puerto Rico, these funds did not exist at all. Complications when it came to the collection of municipal taxes meant that many municipalities either had insufficient funds to meet the needs or no funds at all to allocate toward damages. For example, in Rio Grande, an official remarked in a letter how the expected funds from the municipal budget intended for the repair of the town's Casa de Rey had still not arrived several months after the San Narciso hurricane and the first earthquakes of 1867. Other Spanish officials in Puerto Rico and in Spain attempted to bring to the attention of the Spanish government how investing in the island's infrastructure would show the empire's commitment toward the island and its residents. However, as Fontán y Mera acknowledged, the night of San Narciso, who would believe it, has served as a stimulus not only to ponder very regrettable events, but also to give free rein to exalted imaginations. The hurricane of San Narciso had arrived at a time of political and economic crisis in Puerto Rico and the Spanish Empire. In Cuba, a brewing anti-Spanish sentiment was on the brink of erupting into full-out war. Spain was in danger of losing its last two Caribbean colonies, and it needed to move quickly to prevent that. The 1860s in Puerto Rico were marked by uncertainties amid an increase in political unrest and sedition. A small but increasingly influential sector of Puerto Rican residents had, for decades, advocated for an increase in autonomy and recognition from the Spanish government. This group, led by Dr. Ramon Emeterio Betances, spent decades upholding the major tenets of what was becoming a nascent Puerto Rican independent movement. The abolition of slavery was an essential principle of this independent movement and central to the demands of Puerto Rican liberals. Betances had been involved in the abolitionist movement for a long time and was particularly active in the manumission of enslaved children. In 1866, Spain convened a series of special hearings with Cuban and Puerto Rican representatives in which both colonies would be given the opportunity to present their demands for reforms. This junta de Información de Ultramar, is where some Puerto Rican representatives, including the liberal Segundo Ruiz Belvis, presented their proposal for the immediate abolition of slavery in Puerto Rico. Although an agreement with the reformist Spanish government had been reached, it would quickly become obsolete as once again, Spain underwent a dramatic political change to a new revolutionary but conservative regime that opposed the agreed upon reforms and the abolition of slavery. With the prospect of reforms and abolitions through dialogue with the colonial Spanish government collapsing, a disappointed Betances and Ruiz Belvis went into their exiles with the intention of planning an insurrection within the next year. By the time the insurrection was scheduled to take place, Puerto Ricans would have experienced one of the most destructive periods of natural phenomena the archipelago had ever experienced. What would become the Grito de Lares had been brewing for some time. Its planners had been planting the seeds of rebellion for years, and the Spanish were well aware of this sentiment. In an exchange between the governors of Puerto Rico and Cuba, the colonial governor in Puerto Rico refers to the existence of a vast conspiracy very close to exploding to proclaim the independence of these two Spanish Antilles. Many Puerto Ricans had served in the armed forces during Spain's campaign in the Dominican Republic and witnessed firsthand the failures of the Spanish. It was known among the Spanish officials in Puerto Rico that some of these militiamen sympathized with Dominican sovereignty, an idea that alarmed a Spanish empire desperately clinging to its colonial possessions. Spanish fears of immunity were vindicated when in June 1867, months prior to the San Narciso hurricane, immunity among militiamen in San Juan erupted. After quickly subduing the mutineers, fierce anti-reformist governor Jose Maria Marchesi took this as an opportunity to argue for further restrictions of native-born Puerto Ricans and liberal intellectuals in the island. There were some people who, either in their ignorance, thought there to be no threat of insurrection, or in their hubris sought to dip these tensions, believed that this mutiny was not indicative of things to come. The aforementioned Alexander Jourdain, the United States consul in San Juan, wrote a letter addressed to the United States Secretary shortly after the mutiny that this was merely the attempt of a military insurrection, and while there is general discontent on the island against the actual government, no civilian revolution is expected at present. As such, Jourdain believed that the June 1867 mutiny in San Juan was given much more importance by the Spanish government in Puerto Rico than it actually warranted. Months later, in another dispatch in 1868, Jourdain describes the general sentiment in Puerto Rico to be, as usual, perfectly quiet, and the military insurrection of June last is entirely forgotten, and that the fantastical dream of a revolution in the island has passed away. For all of his belief that everything was bliss and perfect in the island, little did the United States consul know, or little did he reveal, that the plans for a general insurrection had already been put in place. The rebellion in Puerto Rico was originally planned to commence on September the 29th in the city of Camuy. But Spanish officials found out about this upcoming insurrection when an organizer was arrested just days before the originally planned date. As a consequence, Manuel Rojas, the commander-in-chief of the Liberation Army, gathered the revolutionaries of the Centro Bravo cell in his coffee estate in Lares and decided to move up the date of the revolt and initiate the first act pro-independence rebellion against the Spanish in Puerto Rico. The San Narciso hurricane and the subsequent earthquakes of 1867, caused considerable dismay to the coffee-producing residents of the western central municipality of Lares. In Lares, Fontana y Mera lists 1 death and 52,701 escudos in agricultural losses. The most impactful hurricane in contemporary Puerto Rican history struck the archipelago on September 20th, 2017. Hurricane Maria commenced its path across the island when it struck the southeastern town of Yabucoa at 135 miles per hour. The gigantic diameter of the hurricane meant that most of Puerto Rico experienced the heavy rains and the powerful winds of Hurricane Maria. The hurricane's trajectory took the eye of the storm from the northwest, from the southeast of Puerto Rico, all the way across the island to the northwest, where it exited towards the Atlantic Ocean. Puerto Ricans experienced large floods, and as the heavy rainfalls caused increased water levels across the island. In some areas, the water level reached 6 to 9 feet above ground level and rainfalls of up to 38 inches. The power grid quickly gave way, and most of the island would be left in darkness for months to come. People lost their homes as they witnessed their roofs being torn apart. Financial estimates measure the total loss at a value of $90 billion. The exact death toll associated with Hurricane Maria was the subject of much controversy and uncertainty in the months that followed the hurricane. Official government reports set the death toll at 65 deaths and unceasingly kept the figure for months thereafter. Yet the people of Puerto Rico knew that this number could not be true. People had seen firsthand the destruction. They had seen their own family members, friends, and neighbors pass away. How could it be that 65 people died when they had seen so much more? A popular official death toll was thus adopted amongst the people, following a Harvard study estimating the death toll to be around 4,645. Most of these 4,645 deaths were attributed to disruptions in healthcare, largely caused by the destruction of the electrical grid. Despite what the government at the time officially disclosed to the public as the death toll for Hurricane Maria, outside studies had shown drastically contrasting numbers that aligned more closely with the lived experiences of people across the archipelago. The government's stubborn insistence on the relatively low death toll aggravated the general sense of distrust and amongst the people of Puerto Rico against their government. The distrust that would characterize Ricardo Rosselló's tenure was rooted in what many considered to be a negligent response for aid and relief by his administration. This notion was vindicated when months and even years later, the discovery of large amounts of unused and undistributed relief materials made multiple headlines in Puerto Rico. At least 2 years later, some people still had not had their roofs repaired and still had to cover their homes with blue tarps. The distrust for the government's ability to confront Hurricane Maria's effects also extended to the United States' efforts and attitudes towards Puerto Rico. And perhaps the most infamous and recognizable moment in Hurricane Maria relief efforts, US President Donald Trump hurled paper towels towards Puerto Ricans, mimicking a basketball shot. What was even more insulting for many Puerto Ricans in the archipelago was that while this happened, and all through President Trump's blatantly patronizing visit, Governor Ricardo Rosselló simply stood there and echoed any inaccuracies hurled by his commander-in-chief. The economic situation in Puerto Rico, prior to the arrival of Hurricane Maria in 2017, had left the Puerto Rican government on the brink of bankruptcy. If the United States federal bankruptcy laws did not prohibit Puerto Rico from being able to declare bankruptcy, then it probably would have. The island's economy had begun to plunge at the turn of the century with the rise of neoliberalization and the phasing out of federal manufacturing incentives in Puerto Rico. The 2008 global recession had hit the island hard, and by 2015, Puerto Rico had yet to recover. In that year, the governor of Puerto Rico, Alejandro Garcia Padilla, declared the island's current debt as unpayable, given the island's current economic situation. The government's public debt had reached an outstanding $74 billion by March of 2017. The reality of Puerto Rico's economy was a dire one. Puerto Rico had been in constant recession since 2008, and there seemed to be no light at the end of the tunnel. Puerto Rico's crippling debt and lack of economic growth led the United States, the one with the ultimate control of the island's affairs, to appoint a fiscal oversight and management board in Puerto Rico. On June 30th, 2016, US President Barack Obama signed the Puerto Rico Oversight Management Economic Stability Act, or PROMESA, that established this oversight board. The implications of PROMESA and the Fiscal Oversight and Management Board brought out, once again, concerns over Puerto Rico's political status. This unelected, thus fundamentally undemocratic board was granted supremacy over any territorial law or regulation that is inconsistent with the act or fiscal reform plans. This meant that this junta had the ultimate fiscal authority in Puerto Rico above any local or law or policy. At the same time, Puerto Rican general elections loomed in the later months of 2016. The unusual context of this election was determined by the reality of a junta that hovered around any gubernatorial candidate who won. In the end, the New Progressive Party's candidate, Ricardo Rosselló, won the gubernatorial election with a relatively low percentage of 41% of the voters, considering that most election winners up to that point had earned in the high 40s and low 50s in percentage. What was also surprising about the electoral results was the relatively high voting percentage that third-party and independent candidates received in around 20%. Considering that these usually combine for around 5%, keen observers of Puerto Rican electoral history could see an interesting shift in voting paradigms. The conditions in the island would continue to deteriorate in the months to follow the election, all the way up to September 2017, where the situation plummeted at the hands of a colossal storm. All right. Almost 2 years after the Hurricane Maria, on July 8th, 2019, while the memory of the devastating natural phenomena was still fresh in people's mind, a small batch of leaked messages from within Governor Ricardo Rosselló's Telegram group chat were released to the public. The contents of these messages displayed homophobic, racist, and vulgar remarks that repulsed many people in Puerto Rico. In one particular deplorable message, Sobrino Vega, a government official and advisor to Rosselló, mocked those who perished after Hurricane Maria, stating that now that we are on the subject, don't we have some cadavers to feed our crows? Upon the chat's release, one political commentator stated that the Telegram chats crudely revealed what many Puerto Ricans had felt for some time, that a group of privileged and powerful male politicians who managed the colony for the empire saw the populace as simple-minded colonial wards. People had lost so much and seen so much destruction after Hurricane Maria. They had witnessed firsthand the government's inability to help them during their times of greatest needs. The Telegram chat gave Puerto Ricans evidence. It gave them a spark that had not been seen in Puerto Rico in a long time, a spark that would erupt into one of the most impactful social political movements in Puerto Rico. What is now referred to as el Verano del 2019 in Puerto Rico emerged from this leaking of Governor Rosselló's telegram. In a couple days, by July 22nd of 2019, an estimated 1 million people packed one of Puerto Rico's most important highways and started a nationwide one-day strike. These approximately 1 million people were supported by world-recognized Puerto Rican celebrities such as Ricky Martin, Bad Bunny, Residente, and Benicio del Toro. 2 days later, on July 24th, 2019, Ricardo Rosselló delivered his final address and resigned from his position, effective on the 2nd of August. More than a week of daily protesting and violent skirmishes between protesters and riot police had finally culminated. Puerto Rico had ousted a governor for the first time in its history. As in the San Narciso hurricane case 150 years prior, Hurricane Maria was not the sole factor in the eruption of the Verano del 2019. Yet, one could say that without the passing of Hurricane Maria, these events would have never unfolded the way that they did. Hurricane Maria was a political disaster because it unveiled the political disaster that was Puerto Rico's political class. It was a catalyst because in this unveiling, it unleashed social political movements that transformed the political paradigms of Puerto Rico. Hurricanes have had serious implications on the political history of Puerto Rico. Hurricanes have compounded on existing social, economic, and political conditions in ways that have exacerbated the pre-existing situations in the archipelago. Two hurricanes, 150 years apart, highlight the complexities of hurricanes throughout the history of Puerto Rico. The San Narciso hurricane in 1867 and Hurricane Maria in 2017 are two essential historical actors within their own respective historical context. And thank you. I apologize for losing audio, but yeah, thank you.
Okay, muchísimas gracias, Adrián. That was fascinating, and I just want to open up the floor right now for any questions that anybody might have. Feel free to put your questions into the text for Adrián. And I, for myself, one of I guess I can sort of make some commentaries on the presentation while we're waiting for questions to start rolling in. I think one of the things that the moment that we're living in the kind of so-called Anthropocene, where we're really seeing the effects of humanity's impact on the environment, and it raises our awareness of storms like Katrina, Maria, and then also heightens our awareness of our own governments failing, particularly in the case of the United States after both those storms, for communities that have been historically disenfranchised. And I think what's important about your study is that, in a way, you're showing us that the goals of decolonization is actually not something necessarily in the present or always already in the future, but it's something that has been historically enacted. And in fact, hurricanes in some ways participate in those histories. I think of, in my own research, I'm looking at the hurricane of 1928, which in some ways, we see sort of opposite histories, at least in the case of, Cuba and the Dominican Republic in 1926 and 1930, where dictators move in and very quickly rebuild and use that public infrastructure as evidence of their goodwill. Whereas in the case of the 1867 hurricane, and then after Maria, we see how government's inaction and failure creates this ground for the kind of radical solutions that lays the groundwork for a range of radical solutions that we need to consider and engage in order to better, in the case of Puerto Rico, to better the lives of Puerto Ricans, in the case of there are other historic events, the hurricane of 1780, for example, that destroyed ships of British troops coming to aid the U.S. Revolution. That actually, in that case, that kind of you can start to trace a sort of I guess, a criminologist's wall of, these different dots, where hurricanes actually in many ways have always been participating in these revolutionary developments. Sometimes it's the hurricane lays the groundwork for revolution. Sometimes it lays the groundwork for a caudillo like Machado or Trujillo. I guess in those ramblings, I can build up to a question of, what do you think is the the lessons to be learned in terms of the necessary responses politically and also in terms of society after these major catastrophic events? How these catastrophic events have shaped the Caribbean, have shaped Puerto Rico, and maybe what they might tell us about where we go from here.
Yeah, great question. I think the one thing that comes to mind is that hurricanes are not natural disasters, that there's no such thing as natural disasters, right? The disaster comes from the social, political, and economic arrangement that exists at the moment in the particular space where the hurricane hits, right? The hurricane does not exist to destroy, it is a natural phenomena. These inequalities, the disaster stems from, right, that historical context, right? And you mentioned how like hurricanes have been like forces for both empire and decolonization. And I think going off of that, like hurricanes are socially selective. So the more marginalized communities are greatly impacted. And I think the lesson that you can take from that is, like, if you reconceptualize the hurricane as not a natural disaster, and that the disaster comes from, your response, your relief, your reconstruction, then you give more importance to the fact that you have to make the effort to, reconstruct or relieve, aid. Yeah, I think it kind of removes that determinism that the natural disaster is going to destroy, and you can't do anything about it when you can.
Do we have any questions from the listeners? Well, I'll keep asking greedily, because I'm getting a lot out of this. I actually, I wasn't as aware of the events that of this hurricane in 1867, and it was personally very excited to learn of this connection, because it kind of is building off of things that are bubbling around in my own research surrounding kind of the politics of hurricanes. A lot of accounts of the Haitian Revolution may be apocryphal, but French chroniclers and Haitian chroniclers from the late 19th century would later add the fact that those revolutions began. The Bois Commons ceremony occurs on a dark and stormy night, right? So there's this conflation with hurricanes and these events of change. And then I think of, are you looking at also, there's two questions that I would be interested in kind of following. One would be the events that in your project, are you conceiving of these as two particular case studies, or are you also interested in, San Seriaco, for example, and these other major hurricanes that happen between, which might have counter narratives, or might reveal a different, I think 1867 and then these protests in 2019 pair beautifully. And then also, I guess in the wider Caribbean, I think of the hurricane of 1846 in Cuba, which also destroyed. You probably are aware of Luis Perez Jr.'s work, where he talks about how the plantation economy was kind of redefined after those hurricanes as well.
Yeah. So what was your question? Excuse me.
So the question is, what sort of kind of insights and connections can you draw from, other kind of relationships between politics and hurricanes here in Puerto Rico, and then also in the greater Caribbean?
Yeah, in terms of, I am looking into San Ciriaco and San Felipe as well, because those are the biggest ones, the most important, the ones that transformed either the Puerto Rican economy, the infrastructure, etc. And I think, right, that connection, that comparison between the 1867 and Maria is pretty evident, but I think also 1867 with 1899, the differences between Spanish colonial efforts of reconstruction versus the U.S. coming in and taking San Ciriaco as an opportunity to legitimize their new colonial, overlord or whatever. And in terms of the rest of the Caribbean, I'm not entirely totally familiar with hurricanes across the Caribbean. So, I mean, that's something that I should definitely look into and try to find some parallels there. Yeah.
Well, Reynaldo Roman just offered a kind of great question, which I think helps us to understand, the so what of this talk too. Is can you comment on how this account builds on the existing historiography?
Yeah. On the existing, I think that the historiography of hurricanes in general, which I think hurricanes in Puerto Rico in general, is pretty underdeveloped, which is what I'm trying to do, not just through San Narciso, but San Ciriaco, San Felipe. And I want to, explore Santa Ana in 1825, Nuestra Señora de Los Ángeles in 1837, Santa Clara in 1950s, etc. So I guess the way that it builds on the current historiography is, I guess, go more in depth into the historical context that the political, economic, social context in which these hurricanes occur. For example, I think making that connection with coffee and the hurricane and Lares is kind of one way that I approached the 1867 hurricane. And yeah, I guess that's my goal, is to deepen that historiography, kind of create a deeper analysis of hurricanes in Puerto Rico and the history of Puerto Rico, aside from just chronicling what happened, but also around what was going around while it happened.
I would also be interested in how you see your work as an intervention in the historiography, for example, of the Grito de Lares.
Yeah, adding the hurricane as a factor into the Grito de Lares. I think from the historiography that I'm familiar with, and they mention it here and there, that there was this hurricanes that happened in 1867, a year before, and it had this effect. But I tried to really go into that coffee aspect, because coffee is a very vulnerable crop in terms of natural phenomena, especially hurricanes. In Cuba, that was the example in Cuba as well, in the 1840s with the coffee. In 1899 with San Ciriaco, it was a destruction of the coffee crop, and that's when the U.S. took the time to transition into sugar as the main export product. So I think in terms of the Grito de Lares, maybe focusing on the hurricane as a factor, not the factor, but a factor in why maybe the leaders, not Betances and the other intellectuals and exiled intellectuals, but the actual people that fought in the Grito de Lares, the cafeteros, that were in debt with the Spanish merchants, that lost their crop for the year, so they didn't, they were under pressure to make money to pay the debt. So I think that is one connection.
Yeah, thank you, Melody. If anybody has a question, please write it in on the Q&A chat. You can just click on it, and then we can see which questions you've posted. You mentioned, oh, sorry, go ahead. What's that?
There's a question in the Q&A.
Oh, okay. So Axel asks, Cadelau, moving forward, do you think that natural disasters will move Puerto Rico closer to revolution?
I think that the climate change has exacerbated the strength of the hurricanes, the amount of hurricanes that happen. So I think that we might be a position that Puerto Rico will face more hurricanes as the years come. Even this year we had Fiona, and people, like, there was very unhappiness with like the Pierluisi administration and how they handled that. But I think I think it's possible as more hurricanes hit, the more difficult it will be for the government not to do something. And as that happens, then the general feeling against these governments, against the PNP, Populares, or whoever's in power at the time. So yeah, I think that it's a possibility. I don't have a definite answer for whether it all depends if there's a lot of hurricanes, which hopefully that's not true. But yeah. Thank you for the question.
You mentioned, and this is something that I found in my own research, that the history of hurricanes is actually surprisingly sparse. There's not, there's Stuart Schwartz's book. There are exceptions. I mentioned Louis Perez Jr.'s. Raquel Rosario here has done some work on San Ciprián as well, or San Ciriaco, but it can be a challenge to find sources, and I'm curious, what have you done to kind of work around that? What sort of sources do you draw from for this kind of history?
I feel like there's, for example, at San Narciso, there's like the Spanish official that I mentioned, Vicente Montanimera. He published a whole 150-page book or manuscript that detailed exactly what happened and so I think that was a very useful source. And I think when comparing the archival sources that I had and the figures that he posted in his manuscript, they aligned. So I assumed that I was pretty accurate. And there's, I think the way that I approached it, there's like bits and pieces of the 1867 hurricane mentioned in different books, whether it's like a book by Fernando Picó, El Grito de Lares book by Olga Jimenez de Wagenheim. The Stuart Schwartz book has some decent amount of that. And as well as archival sources is what I kind of relied on to like try to build the narrative of like these towns suffered this US consul thought about this, etc. And yeah. How would you approach that? How have you approached it?
Well, that's why I asked, because one thing that was posed to me that I think is, it can be, I think there are limits in the archive, right, in terms of what voices are recorded. And, what are the solutions to that? Not being an anthropologist necessarily by trade, but and trained in doing kind of the sort of field research that would involve interviews with people who experience these storms. But it is something that I've considered integrating more into my own research, and I'm curious if that's something you've thought about. I think particularly for the material that's dealing with the 2019 protests, that sort of thing, but even hurricanes that maybe people have lived through, in order to kind of recuperate those voices that wouldn't necessarily be recorded in official records.
Yeah, I agree. I think when I'm going into my research, and especially the 1867 hurricane San Narciso, I really wanted to like build a history from below and see those narratives from the people on the ground. But those are the ones that are not present in the archive. So I think going forward, I guess my job is to try to find that, see where I can find it. One thing that I do want to do when I go back to Puerto Rico in January is go into like the municipal fund like collections to see what they have regarding the hurricane, because I was only able to seek out Isabela when I was there. That's why I talked about it. But yeah, and I guess it's easier for it when you're talking about Maria, because you can talk to somebody who lived through it. You can have interviews with people who were in the protests and use that as like your primary source, because it is a primary source to have these oral histories.
So you kind of hinted at it, and again, if anybody has a question, that you want to jump in, but you're going to be coming back to do some more research, and I guess the sort of maybe the final question, unless we have another one, would be, where does the project go from here?
My thesis for my master's, that's
or the book
plan.
that follows, the dissertation,
and the book that follows. Hopefully, I know it's a difficult process to. I mean, I'm very optimistic. I have ambitions. I have all these grand plans that I'm going to publish this book about the history of hurricanes in Puerto Rico. But the reality is, I'm a grad student. I'm applying a PhD program, so that's my focus right now. But I think one thing that I want to, when I go back in January, and I plan to come back in the summer to continue doing that project, is look at the hurricanes that we really don't know about, but they're pretty big. Like the ones I mentioned, like Santa Ana, it was one of the most deadliest hurricanes, and it came at a time that Puerto Rico was in a transition demographically, economically in 1825, and the Los Angeles hurricane in 1837 was also a very big, powerful storm. So I think those are apart from San Ciriaco and San Felipe, that I will also look into, and I currently am. I have another talk next 2 weeks from now for San Felipe, and then, but those are like looking into the lesser known, less developed historiography of some hurricanes.
Excellent. Well, yeah, follow up with an email about your talk on San Felipe. I'd really like to check that out. And unless we have any further questions, I think this might be a kind of a nice bookend for our discussion. Adrián, thank you so much. Melody, thank you for your kind introductions. Thanks to everybody for your questions.